Why don't we begin in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit? Amen. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for the time we have together as we go deeper into our understanding of the institution of the papacy and the importance that it has for our church. Bless our time together, that it may be profitable for your sight and in your community through Christ our Lord. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Welcome back. In our Foundations of Faith series, we are in a transition period really between the medieval church and the Renaissance. And but at the same time, we're going to be kind of backing up a little bit into what you might call the the Dark Ages. And and there's going to be some bouncing back and forth. So historians are divided as to what actually defines the Middle Ages. And generally it is subdivided into periods of early, middle, and late, which is arbitrary, but you have to have some kind of framework. Now at the outset, I'm going to warn you that this was not an era of sweetness and light, as the world is emerging from an extraordinarily difficult period in the history of Western civilization. In fact, it wasn't called the Dark Ages for nothing. Now, I'm beginning this section with a quick look at the tenuous and often fragmented state of the church as a unity, as the first really significant crisis befalls the church, which is that great East-West schism that happens in this era. Now, let's get in our minds, or perhaps out of our minds, that there was ever a time in the history of the church when everyone was singing out of the same hymnal. Okay? The terminology that we historically use to subsequently describe the church, that is, the church in the East as opposed to the church in the West, was in common use well before that magic date of 1054 that we identify as the Great Schism between the Eastern and Western churches, the year when the church in the East and West more or less parted company one from another, with the East being then described or labeled as Orthodox, and the West self-identifying with the language in use at the time in Latin, but actually adopting the word Catholic along the way. So initially it was the Latin West and the Greek East, Orthodox East. Truthfully though, it is actually when both sides gave up what had been a centuries-long struggle. Catholic East, Catholic West becomes Catholic East and Orthodox West. These are the terms that continue in use now 1,000 years later, but they were not originally in any sense mutually exclusive terms. The whole church was Orthodox. The whole church was Catholic. So there was no understanding that there was a different church, as you will. And like any divorce, it was a drip by drip process, being confusing with those terms, Catholic and Orthodox, being confusing initially, if really not just meaningless. Catholic means universal, but it becomes only universal in the minds of those who call themselves such, as long as everyone toes their mark, or in the case of the Western Church, the papal mark. All right? Orthodoxy is only orthodox in the Orthodox mind when it is exclusively and subjectively so, which is actually currently impossible, because orthodoxy means right belief. Both sides claim to be both Catholic and Orthodox. So the problem is the terms are no longer objective. And besides all this, neither church, East or West, originally identified itself by these terms. It was simply ecclesia, the church. The word Catholic comes into general use really around the year 400 in order to identify Orthodox Christians over and against heretics. Hence the term Catholic Christians, which oddly enough identified the one true church as being apostolic and universal. So today we are two bodies of the same church, each Catholic and each Orthodox, but just not in each other's eyes. Now, how about that for being obtuse? Now, another important consideration is that everybody saw this coming. They saw it coming from as early as the 3rd century. The era of the great councils of Ephesus, Chalcedon, Constantinople, and on and on. That's why the why of the split isn't easy to pinpoint. And yet you'd have to be blind not to see it coming. There's no single point of contention or issue that proved to be the catalyst for this divorce. That's not to say they didn't invent one later on, and we'll look at that sometime else. But from 1048 to 1257, the papacy encountered escalating conflicts with the Holy Roman Empire, and particularly with the Byzantine Empire, leading to what is going to be the final East-West schism, which divided the Latin and the Greek churches. Now, truthfully, the primary causes of the schism were disputes over conflicting claims of jurisdiction, in particular, ecclesiastical authority. Pope Leo IX claimed he held authority over the 4 Eastern patriarchs and over the insertion of the Filioque clause into the Nicene Creed by the Western Patriarch in the year 1014. But the roots of the division are really far older and much, much deeper. And they are in equal parts cultural as well as economic. And probably less so theological. In fact, theology had almost nothing to do with it. Even though prior to the Catholic Church being one entity with both Eastern and Western branches, in the beginning there was not any sense of there being anything beyond a federation of churches that all existed side by side, one with another. And there was no real push for uniformity. There was no uniformity. In fact, it was this sort of plurality within the kingdoms that identified the church itself. No one worshiped the same. No one sang out of the same hymnal, if you will. And certainly there were language issues. But the primary causes of the schism are obviously going to be about who's in charge. Who's in charge? Now, the Latin push for uniformity and the Eastern preference for local rule created this scenario where nothing can ever be argued or effectively agreed upon. It was necessary, however, for this federation to come to some agreement on essential issues, which is the reason for the calling of these special councils, the results of which were used throughout the federation. This was all fine as long as everyone was willing to live with certain ambiguities, particularly where church and state are involved. For example, over the first 400 years, there was no recognized central authority that held power over other churches. And the Bishop of Rome was not initially considered, as we would understand it today, as primus inter pares, a first among equals. Just equals, regardless of the important subsequent history, has imposed upon the Roman bishops. In fact, Constantine had relocated the seat of the Roman Empire to Byzantium and planted the seed for the East to flourish as the center of ecclesiastical activity, which indeed it was. All of the major councils of the church were in the Greek Empire, were in the East. All of the documents were authorized by Eastern church leaders. And I guess this had much more to do with geography than it did with ecclesiology. Now, in addition, the Eastern church fathers were highly suspicious of the influence of Roman pagan religions, as bits and pieces of it were routinely showing up in Christian practice. Now, of itself, this was tolerable to Eastern churches as long as they weren't subject to any of its influences. By the end of the 4th century, the empire was permanently divided between the last Roman Empire to rule the entire United Empire, and this would be Theodosius I, who dies in the year 395. And that's when the socio-political changes wrought or actually impelled the Western Empire to almost near collapse. And when it disintegrated in the 5th century, its lands were conquered and ruled by the Germanic tribes, while the Eastern Empire continues for another 1,000 years. Now, add to all of this a language barrier. The East was Greek speaking and the West was Latin, but there was no clear line of demarcation. Documents going back and forth were commonly mistranslated, resulting in a variety of issues, not the least of which was the interpretation of the meaning of the creeds themselves. And by the time of Charlemagne in the 800s, the supreme power of the papacy was fully established, but this was not the case with the bishops in the East, who still operated very much as a federation. Now, anyone who tries to pin the split on a disagreement on the nature of the Holy Spirit in the Nicene Creed is really grossly oversimplifying the issue. What happens in the year 1054 is simply an acknowledgement of the reality at hand. And the true and official divorce isn't going to be finalized until the Council of Florence in the 15th century, which was an attempt to mend fences, but everyone summarily rejected each other, and especially the Russians. Typical. So, who were the popes in these waning years of the Dark Ages? Now, I've already mentioned the challenge presented by the Saracen invasions last week. This is going to be an ongoing problem for the church, and it's never gone away. Another issue is the internal European conflicts, such as the ones between the Franks and the Lombards. It was crucial to establish diplomacy in order to continue any actual missionary activity of the church. So let's begin with Adrian I. Now, he's going to be remembered, if he's remembered at all, as one of the popes who had to put up with the constant bickering between Charlemagne and Carloman I. Now, what was the problem? The Lombards were hell-bent on expanding their holdings in Italy at the expense of the papacy. Not getting any support from Constantinople, the popes looked for help to the Franks, the French. Adrian's tenure saw the culmination of this ongoing territorial dispute between Charlemagne and his brother Carloman I. The Lombard king supported the claims of Carloman's sons to their late father's lands and requested, call it what you want, Pope Adrian to crown Carloman's sons king of the Franks. When the Pope failed to do this, the Lombard king Desiderius invaded papal territory known as the Five Cities and seized all of the land belonging to the church. Charlemagne besieged the city of Pavia and took the Lombard crown for himself. He then restored the 5 cities known as the Pentapolis to the papacy, as well as some of the captured Lombard territories. Now, 2 things we pick up from this. 1, the church by the 8th century has become a significant landholder. And 2, popes are now so politically powerful as to have the power of coronation. Now, as much as I would love to linger over all the extraordinary intrigue that percolates around these two realities throughout these years, we got to move on. I would love just to do a 3-year-long study of church history. That we could actually go into some of the meat of all this. But after Adrian came Gregory II, who had to deal with the first icon kerfluffle and the fallout that followed. Now, what do I mean? From a theological point of view, the 8th century is dominated by iconoclastic controversies. Now, what is that? Roughly between the years 726 and 787, the Byzantine Emperor Leo III, this all gets very confusing because the emperors take names that the popes have, and they also have numbers after their names. So you don't know who's on first at any particular point in time. So Leo III, who's a Byzantine emperor, issues a series of edicts concerning the veneration of images. Why? Well, I wish I could say it was due to a matter of conscience on his part about the theological implication of showing reverence for religious images, perhaps because he had been contemplating the first commandment and couldn't tolerate it any longer. Countenance of this might then appear as some form of idolatry. I wish I could give him that kind of credit, but alas, the Emperor Leo interpreted his many military failures as a judgment on the empire by God and decided that his kingdom was being judged for the worship of religious images because it could have possibly been due to his ineptness for which he was famous, or his generals who to a man were chronic drunkards. It couldn't be that. But the results were staggering. The first iconoclastic results were staggering. Unfortunately, we don't have time to evaluate this or weep over the immeasurable loss of religious art dating from the early 3rd century, because all of that was wiped out almost overnight. And to make matters worse, there were no truly reliable sources for any details in all of this. Not only are our sources limited, but what texts do exist are nearly all written by iconophiles, often much later, and obviously in a very polemical manner. There will be a second iconoclastic movement, but first let's visit the issue from the perspective of why icons were important. Christian worship by the 6th century had developed a clear belief in the intercession of saints. A very strong sacramentality and belief in the physical presence represented by icons also joined a belief in the intercession of the saints with the use of relics and those holy images or icons in early Christian practices. And this is still very much the case today in the Eastern churches. The Eastern church sees an icon as a window into the numinous, into the holy. It isn't just an image of a long gone saint. It is that actual presence of that saint among us. And so it invites veneration. Okay? But little of this found its way into the Western church, which hadn't invested the same kind of enthusiasm in icons as did their Eastern counterparts. The pagan Roman habit of carving images in stone was far more appealing. And that in turn irritated the Easterners, who considered, and possibly rightly so, the use of 3D images as much closer to the sort of thing the first commandment condemned. Okay, we're done with this. By the way, you can always tell the difference between icons prior to the first iconoclastic condemnations and the ones that follow. The ones prior all sought to be actual, as good as they could get, images of the saint that they were striving to show. Afterwards, in an effort not to be representative, they all look exactly alike. If you see an icon of St. Mary, it looks just like an icon of St. Helen. And it looks just like an icon of St. any other woman, and they all look alike. Anyway. So after Gregory II came Gregory III, and he keeps up the battle against the iconoclasts, even inviting Charlemagne and the Franks into the fray. Now Charlemagne also opposed the iconoclasts and eventually called the Second Council of Nicaea into session in the year 787, which affirmed the legitimacy of the use of icons. Icons are back. Later comes Stephen II, whose alliance with Pepin the Short, the king of the Franks. Can you imagine going through life with that name? Well, anyway, that alliance solidifies the independence of the papal states. Now, there are other popes, of course, but what we know of them is either unreliable or uninteresting or both. Perhaps with the exception of John VI, whose reign was between 701 and 705. He's the one in whose writings we find actual references to the extraordinary astronomical events that are occurring at this time. Very much as a result of whatever phenomenon created the true Dark Ages, or those 3 years in which the sun was nearly blanked out. There was 3 years of winter, great famine across the world, death and plagues and trees and agriculture dying, the effects of which will continue for what? More than 1,000 years. And many scientists believe it was a volcanic event. Other scientists believe that it was an asteroid that broke up in the atmosphere. Whatever it was, it changed the world. It completely changed the world. And we know very little about it, except for those people who are doing a great deal of research into the legends that begin in that time. You don't have a lot of literature or anything, but you do have a lot of legends. And many of those that surround Arthur, King Arthur, make oblique references to this sort of thing. And of course, everybody thought the world was coming in and it was judgment time and all this. But I wish I had more time to go into that, but we don't. But anyway, I bring up John VI only to point out that the Latin West wasn't necessarily always Latin. John was from Ephesus, and he was a Greek-speaking pope. Now, there was an interesting event surrounding Wilfrid, the Bishop of York. Now, bear in mind, missionary activity had reached the British Isles. Now, Wilfrid had been expelled from England due to some diocesan intrigue. It seems that the Archbishop of Canterbury, Theodore, was interested in splitting the larger diocese into smaller ones. Wilfrid's diocese was huge, and he liked it that way. So he became very intransigent, digging in his heels with such vehemence that the Northumberland king, Ecgfrith, said, "Enough of this," and expelled him from York. So Wilfrid schlepped off to Rome to appeal to the papacy. Pope Agatho, who came before John, ruled in Wilfrid's favor, but Ecgfrith refused to honor the papal decree and instead imprisoned Wilfrid on his return trip to Northumbria before finally exiling him. Then he goes back to Rome and met with John VI again and noted in his letters that the papal court was by this time entirely Greek-speaking. So that's why I bring all this up, to say, you think everything was in Latin? Mm-mm. John VI convened a synod of Greek-speaking bishops to hear Wilfrid's case, which was a linguistic hurdle that really perturbed Wilfrid, as he did not speak a lick of Greek. Anyway, that's information for all those who imagine that Latin was the language of the church from the time of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Ecgfrith. How do the British come up with these names? And he won't be the last English king to cause trouble for the Catholic Church, as you well know. But before we leave the 8th century, let's talk about Leo III. This time it's actually a pope, who reigned from 795 to 816. Even if for no other reason than to point out the relationship of the papacy to the emergence of what would be the full flourishing of the Holy Roman Empire. Pope Leo crowned Charlemagne. as Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day, 800 AD, primarily to gain Charlemagne's protection and to solidify the Pope's authority within the Papal States. But it sent an ever more powerful message to the whole world that emperors, whoever they may be, are only created so by the Pope. Okay. Charlemagne, in turn, gained the prestige and legitimacy of the imperial title, which helped him expand his influence and control throughout Western Europe. Now, the coronation marked a significant shift in the political landscape of Europe because it reestablished the Western Roman Empire with a new name and created a close alliance between the papacy and the secular order, which is going to have lasting consequences for both of them. The event also created a precedent for future papal coronation of emperors, which solidified the Pope's role in the investiture of imperial power and establishing the papacy as the most powerful office in the Western world. After Leo III, the papacy is going to increasingly take to itself power that could only be compared to the Roman emperors of centuries past. They're going to take more, they're going to add more and more titles to their names. One of them, most interesting, being taken directly from the Roman imperial time as being big bridge builders. Or in Latin, Pontifex Maximus. A pontifex is somebody who builds a bridge. And a Maximus means he's a big one. Okay? Now, the 9th century was an era of huge upheaval in Europe. There was no era in which there was not great upheaval in Europe. The Carolingian Empire, which had been revived by Charlemagne, began to fracture, leading to increased political fragmentation and power struggles. And these struggles impacted the papacy as different factions sought to influence papal elections and policies. However, the 9th century also saw instances where papal authority was both at one time challenged, acknowledged, and then undermined. For example, there were disputes over elections. Can you imagine election disputes? Imagine that. Election fraud. The papacy in the High Middle Ages is where we are now. We've covered the 400s to the 800s with speed that would rival the speed of light, including the periods of the Ostrogoths, which we've ignored studiously, the Byzantines of the 7th century, the Franks, and finally the 8th or the 10th century, which really brings us to the 9th, 10th, and 11th century. Now, the old Roman Empire is a thing of the past. And into the void has arisen the new nobility, among whom come the new Holy Roman Emperors. Where the emperors disappear, families emerge. Families that are still very much with us today. This is a time when rival families fought for control over the cities they owned. Florence, Rome, Milan, and on and on and on. Fighting off the Saracens on one side, the interlopers on the other, making sure that whoever was pope was looking after their interests. And this is the age of some real humdinger popes. And so I want us to dig a few of them up, which might be a poor choice of words when it comes to Pope Formosus. Pope Formosus. He reigned from 816 to 896. He was a ruler of the Papal States and had a famously troubled papacy. Now let's see if I can condense this and still make some sense. Formosus starts out his ecclesiastical career as the Bishop of Portus outside of Rome. It's actually the port of Rome. Pope Nicholas appointed him as the legate to Bulgaria and the court of King Boris I. You remember Boris. Boris requested that Formosus be made the Archbishop of Bulgaria. He wanted that status. But the request was denied since canon law forbade bishops changing dioceses for the benefit of nobility. So instead, he undertook a diplomatic mission to France. Now, during this time, Charles the Bald, bless his heart, was elected as the new Holy Roman Empire after the death of Emperor Louis I in 875. Now, this was opposed, oddly enough, by Louis's brother, who thought because he was his brother, it should have come to him. And the dead emperor's wife, Ingelberga, even took umbrage. Well, it was Bishop Formosus who conveyed Pope John VIII's invitation to Charles to be crowned in Rome. It would have been a normal practice. But Charles chose to get himself crowned in Pavia instead. Now, unhappy with all this and in dead opposition to this coronation, Louis, who was, you remember, the brother of the dead emperor, and Ingelberga proceeded to make a whole lot of noise about this. Charles did eventually come to Rome to get the imperial insignia, and then fearing any political retribution, all those opposed fled Rome, and for reasons unknown, Formosus also left and went to France. Something's going on. Pope John ordered everyone back to Rome, and when Formosus didn't comply, he was removed from the ranks of the clergy and excommunicated on the grounds that he had deserted his diocese without papal permission and had aspired to the position of Archbishop of Bulgaria. And additional charges included the accusations that he had opposed the emperor, conspired with certain iniquitous men and women for the destruction of the papal see, and had despoiled the cloisters in Rome, whatever that means. The condemnation of Formosus and others was announced in July of 876. Well, you would think that was that, but no. In 878, the sentence of excommunication was withdrawn after Formosus promised never to return to Rome or exercise his priestly functions. In 883, we now have Pope Marinus, who restored him to his diocese, and in the October of 891, he was elected pope. The moral of the story is stick with it, as you never know how things will turn out. Shortly after his election, Formosus was asked to intervene in the Patriarchate of Constantinople, which, given the tension between the East and the West, wasn't going to end well. Shortly after his election, Formosus was asked then to intervene with Photius the First, who had been ejected, and then Stephen the First, the son of the Emperor Basil the First, who had taken office. You've really got to know, you've really got to have your cards laying out on the table to know what all this is. But Formosus refused to reinstate anybody who had ever been ordained by Photius. Okay. Photius, as his predecessors, as Pope Stephen V, had nullified all of Photius's ordinations. Now, so what's the problem with Photius, we're going to ask? Well, overall, it's about the ongoing problem between the East and the West. Specifically, it's about this Bishop Photius, who was selected by the emperor, but was never ordained a priest. Which, by the way, had not been considered a real problem in the West, as evidenced the significant number of popes who had never had any benefit of any ecclesiastical training whatsoever, and many of whom had not been even as much as ordained a lector. Okay? So what you do at home is one thing, but the neighbors better toe the mark. The main problem was the papal claim to jurisdiction in the East, not accusations of heresy. And the schism arose largely as a struggle for ecclesiastical control of the southern Balkans. You knew there had to be a property dispute here somewhere, and it was the Balkans. And because of a personality clash between the heads, these two bishops, both of whom were elected in the year 858, both of whose reigns ended in the year 867. Now, the Photian schism helped polarize the East and West for centuries, particularly over a false but widespread belief in a second excommunication of Photius. However, the Eastern bishop determined to recognize Photius' ordinations nonetheless. Because Photius, who, by the way, wasn't even a priest, not to mention a bishop, okay, had been ordaining people left, right, and center. That's like getting the UPS man. Get out of your truck. I've got 4 men here that need to be ordained. Here's a miter. Here's a stole. Go at it. Okay? And if that wasn't enough, Formosus immediately immersed himself in a dispute between Odo of Paris and Charles the Simple for the French throne. Now imagine going through life known as Charles the Simple. By the way, when you Google an image of Charles the Simple, you really have to be prepared for what comes up. Anyway, siding with Charles, Formosus exhorted Odo to cede the throne to Charles, but to no avail. Formosus, for whatever reasons, was deeply distrustful of the reigning emperor, Guy of Spoleto. You remember Guy of Spoleto. And he began looking for support against him, probably because the emperor had forced Formosus to crown his son Lambert as co-emperor in April of 892. Now, the next year, however, Formosus persuaded Arnulf of Carinthia to advance to Rome and liberate Italy from Guy's control. You got to love 9th century political loyalty. Now, Arnulf's army occupied all the north of the Po River, and Guy died in December, leaving Guy's son Lambert in the care of his mother Algetrude, an opponent of the Carolingians. I couldn't find an appropriate picture. This is the closest I could find. Now, to his credit, Pope Formosus was doing the best he could, but generally found himself between the rock of the Carolingians and the Germans, and the hard place of the Italian noble families, with the storm clouds of the remnant Byzantine Empire hanging over his head. So it was obvious that he couldn't please anyone. Of course, Algetrude was unwilling to let bygones be bygones and took umbrage at all of this. So in autumn of 895, Arnulf undertook his second Italian campaign, progressing to Rome by February and seizing the city from Algetrude by force on the 21st of February. The following day, Formosus crowned Arnulf as emperor in St. Peter's Basilica. Now, the new emperor moved against Spoleto and Guy, but was struck with paralysis on the way and was unable to continue with the campaign. Now, if all this wasn't trouble enough, during his papacy, Formosus also had to contend with the Saracens. Oh yeah, we forgot about them. They were attacking Lazio. So one can hardly blame him for taking the easy way out by dying on the 4th of April, 896. He was succeeded by Boniface VI, whose papacy lasted the entirety of 15 days. Sometimes 2 weeks is enough to know when things aren't going to work out. Before being pope, he was a subdeacon. That's all. About whom we know almost nothing except that he was a chronic failure, as he twice incurred a sentence of deprivation of orders as a subdeacon and as a priest. So if you can't succeed as a deacon or a priest, it only makes sense to become a pope. And so now you know the origin of the term, the Peter Principle. Now, as it turns out, and as you know, the papal election was subsequently pronounced null. But history being what it is, there were alternative facts. Boy, that's a 21st century term, isn't it? These alternative facts emerged, which is why some say he died of the gout, others who claim he was forcibly ejected to make way for Stephen VI, the candidate of the Spoletan party, who, by the way, got the throne of Peter largely through the influence of guess who? Algetrude. And Algetrude and Stephen, they were a pair. Okay. Stephen VI, at their behest, called for a trial to posthumously condemn for on the throne to face all the charges from Pope John VIII. The verdict was that the deceased had been unworthy of the pontificate. Really? The damnatio memoriae was applied to Formosus. All his measures and acts were annulled, and the orders conferred by him were declared invalid. A damnatio memoriae is the condemnation of memory, the wiping out of history. The papal vestments were torn from his body. The 3 fingers from his right hand he had used for blessing were cut off, and the corpse was thrown into the Tiber, later to be retrieved by a monk. Following the death of Stephen VI, Formosus' body was reinterred in St. Peter's Basilica, and you can find it there today, but without any benefit of the little summary of which you have just heard. Just his name, which is probably appealing to his spirit. This is why limiting what you write on your tombstone is usually your everlasting credit. Further trials of this nature against deceased persons were banned. But Sergius III, who reigned from 904 to 911, reapproved the decisions against Formosus. He went so far as to demand the reordination of the bishops consecrated by Formosus, who in turn had conferred orders on many other clerics, causing a tremendous amount of confusion. Ostensibly, somewhere in the order of 600 to 700 bishops and 14 to 15,000 priests. Okay. Later, the validity of Formosus' pontificate was reinstated. That was much simpler. The whole thing was a big ping pong game. The decision of Sergius with respect to Formosus has subsequently been universally disregarded by the Catholic Church, since Formosus' condemnation had little to do with piety and more to do with politics. Isn't this fun? Let's move on. From 604 to 756 marks the rise of papal primacy. And it takes that long to get the papacy to style itself as supreme with universal authority. This was an era of a lot of ups and downs with the occupants of the chair of Peter. The 10th century is often referred to as the saeculum obscurum of the dark age of the papacy. But not just the papacy. We see a succession of popes with varying degrees of moral character and political influence. Some key figures include, on one end of the spectrum, John XII, known for his scandalous behavior, and the other end, Sylvester II, a learned scholar who brought intellectual prestige to the papacy, extraordinary spirituality to the church, and proved once again that the gates of hell were not going to prevail against it. But then you had everything else in between. From about 756 to roughly 1048, the popes came to be controlled by the Theophylacty. The Theophylacty, that sounds like something you hope is covered by Medicaid. What it is, in the 10th to 11th centuries, following on the chaos left by the fall of the Roman Empire, a loose federation of families of secular noblemen maintained the most powerful positions in Rome. And when I say noblemen, I really mean their wives. The influence of which gave rise to a legend called Pope Joan. You know, another story for another time. Well, it's just that the papacy was entirely controlled by a group of women known as the pornocracy, looking after the welfare of second sons and third sons and nephews of those who would inherit the nobility titles, if you would. The era spans all of those sons and nephews of all of these nobles for the better part of 100 years. And the papal star of this show is John XII. And I'm going to get to him shortly. But these families together are known as the Counts of Tusculum, and who with Thyatha I at the helm created and perfected the political formula of noble papacy, wherein the Pope was arranged to be elected only from the ranks of the Roman nobles. There were no college of cardinals. Now, if you think election fraud is something new, then think again. This whole time is marked by political intrigue, family control, accusation of corruption, and moral decline. The apex, or the nadir of which, depending on your point of view, is we're going to see in the Renaissance popes, when it's a whole other set of families, the Borgias, the Novelveres, the Medicis, and the Sforzas. Okay? A situation so untenable that the Protestant Reformation was an inevitability. Now, time really forbids a pope-by-pope analysis, so I'm going to highlight one in particular, and this is John the 12th, who reigned from 955 to 964. Pope John was a member of a powerful Italian family, and he was unusual for several reasons. First, he was elected pope probably between the ages of 15 and 17, but no older than 20. Certainly not the youngest, as that honor goes to Benedict IX, who was elected when he was 11. Second, he was both Prince of Rome, a title he inherited from his father Alaric, and Pope at the same time. Now you're starting to get a picture of the papacy that has shifted somewhat. Historically, this also points to the emergence of the influence of these powerful families, but it absolutely corresponds to the influence of the wives of these Roman families who placed their own family members on the chair of Peter. Around 960, after the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, John personally led an attack against the Lombard duchies of Beneventum and Capua, ostensibly to reclaim parts of the papal states which had been lost to them, and attack that he put on was actually unsuccessful. But he also found that he was unable to control the powerful nobility from which he came. He's embarked on a truly Byzantine tangle of negotiation and intrigue. His dual role as Prince of Rome and the spiritual head of the church saw his behavior lean more toward the former than the latter. In the writings which remain about his papacy, he was depicted as a coarse, immoral man whose life was such that the Lateran Palace was spoken of as a brothel, and the moral corruption in Rome became the subject of general disgrace. His lifestyle suited the secular prince he was, and his political enemies would use these accusations to blacken his reputation, not only to justify but to obscure the political dimensions of his deposition. It was generally known that he had a child with his sister. As a pope, he presided over the marriage of his mother, her first marriage. Here is an account of the charges leveled against him at the Senate of Rome in 963. Then, rising up, the cardinal priest Peter testified that he himself had seen John the 12th celebrate Mass without taking communion. John, Bishop of Narni, and John, a cardinal deacon, professed that they themselves saw that a deacon had been ordained in a horse stable, but were unsure of the time. Benedict, cardinal deacon, with other co-deacons and priests, said that they knew that he had been paid for ordaining bishops, specifically that he had ordained a 10-year-old bishop in the city of Todi. They testified about his adultery, which they did not see with their own eyes, but nevertheless knew with certainty. He had fornicated with the widow of Rainer, with Stephania, his father's concubine, and with the widow Anna, and with his own niece, and he had made the sacred palace into a whorehouse. They said he had gone hunting publicly, the scandal. He had gone hunting publicly. Sometimes we don't know that history. That he had blinded his confessor Benedict, and
And thereafter Benedict had died. And then he had killed John, the cardinal subdeacon, after castrating him, and that he set fires, girded on a sword, and another in military attire. All clerics, as well as laymen, declared that he had toasted to the devil with wine. That they saw him playing at dice. He invoked Jupiter, Venus, and other demons. They even said he did not celebrate the canonical hours, nor did he ever make the sign of the cross. Holy Father. Otto I subsequently summoned a council which demanded that John present himself and defend himself against these charges. John responded by threatening to excommunicate anyone who attempted to depose him. The emperor was undeterred, and the council deposed John XII and elected Pope Leo VIII in his stead. But even that was not without drama. It appears about the same time, Benedict V, here's Otto, Benedict V was brought to power in opposition to Leo VIII in an election process that was not nearly as organized as what we have recently witnessed. Now, he ruled the Papal States from the 22nd of May to the 23rd of June, 964. His brief pontificate occurred at the end of the so-called Saeculum Obscurum. Many of the popes that suffered or flourished, depending on who was in favor with the rule of the harlots. And due to the significant influence of these powerful families, this issue with Pope Benedict was an untenable mess, and together with his clerical and lay supporters, and clad in his pontifical robes, Benedict was brought before a synod which Leo had convened. And in the proceedings, Benedict was asked by the archdeacon how he dared to assume the chair of Peter, to take the chair of Peter while Leo was still alive. He was also accused of having broken his oath to the emperor, where he promised never to elect a pope without the emperor's consent. Benedict responded, "If I've sinned, have mercy on me." Having received a promise from the emperor that his life would be spared if he submitted, Benedict threw himself at Leo's feet and acknowledged his guilt. The synod revoked his episcopal consecration. His pallium was torn from him, and his pastoral staff was broken over him by Leo. However, through the intercession of Otto, he was allowed to retain the rank of deacon. Now, this is a century of 20 popes. A record not yet broken, as in one century alone, there were 21 popes. Now, not all died sick in their bed either, as you can tell by this. The ones shown in red are particularly interesting. And just because the others are written in black does not mean that they were much better, but only appearing so by comparison. Okay. So far, we've worked our way very quickly through the first half of this list. The 10th and 11th centuries are a time of both reform and turmoil, with Leo IX, who's considered to be one of the most historically significant popes of the Middle Ages, because he was instrumental in the precipitation of the Great Schism of 1054, which is considered the turning point in which the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches formally separated, or at least in name. And then along with him is Gregory VII, who was the great reformer. And these reforms focused on enhancing the moral integrity and the independence of the clergy, particularly from secular interference. Now, key aspects included enforcing celibacy, combating the problem of nepotism and simony, the buying and selling of church offices, and asserting papal authority over church affairs. Leo IX was one of the last popes to be elected freely by the clergy and the citizens of Rome. The citizens of Rome, for a while, were actually part of electing the popes. It was Leo IX that favored celibacy for the clergy. Now, up until this time, priests and bishops married, had kids. Everybody had families. Some had more than one wife. Well, we know this was true in the very earliest church because there's a specific scripture passage that recommends that a bishop have only one wife. Okay. Above all, Gentiles, the Pope has now the honor of presiding over the issue of what is the true concern, or if you will, authority, influence of the Western Church. And this is all tied up. It's what's known as the donation of Constantine. In short, this is a forged Roman decretal by which the 4th century Emperor Constantine the Great supposedly transferred authority over Rome and the western part of the Roman Empire entirely in the hands of the Pope. Now, it was composed probably in the 8th century, and it was used, especially in the 13th century, in support of claims of political authority by the papacy, particularly as it's being tried to be exercised over the East. Most likely, an early draft of the donation of Constantine was made shortly after the middle of the 8th century to assist Stephen II in his negotiations with Pepin the Short, who then held the position of the mayor of the palace and the manager of the household of the Frankish kings. Stephen II actually crossed the Alps to anoint Pepin, thereby enabling the Carolingian family to take over the Merovingians of that time, the royal Merovingian line. In return for Stephen's support, Pepin gave the Pope the lands in Italy which the Lombards had taken from the Byzantine Empire. It's also possible that it originated with Stephen's immediate successor, Paul I. Now, these lands would become what we know as the Papal States, and were going to be the basis of the papacy's temporal power for the next 11 centuries. Now, rewriting history is a game that anybody can play. The problem, however, it is always expensive in one way or another, like twice renaming military forts across the nation to eradicate the memory of Civil War military personnel. That bill sits today at $65 million. The renaming of the forts back to their original name. That's called economic, I'll let it sit. Moving on. Back to forgery. The text of the forgery recounts what's called the Acts of Sylvester. Now, this tale describes the sainted Pope's. Will you try to find a picture of Pope Sylvester on the internet? It describes Pope Sylvester's rescue of the Romans from the depredations of a local dragon. What? And the pontiff's miraculous cure of the emperor's leprosy by the sacrament of baptism. Now, it's a local dragon, not one of those foreign ones. Anyway, the story is contained entirely in the Liber Pontificalis, which is the history of the popes. And yes, it does talk about there being a dragon. Anyway, by the later 8th century, the dragon slayer Sylvester and his apostolic successors were rewarded in the donation of Constantine with the temporal powers never in fact exercised by the historical bishops of Rome under Constantine. And that should have been your first clue. Leo, however, thinking that the document was real, responded to a letter from the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius, denouncing the use of unleavened bread for the Eucharist, citing the forgery as proof of his supremacy in all these matters. And that's when things really got worse. From Rome, a bill of excommunicated was delivered to Michael, on which the Patriarch called Warzaki. What Michael didn't know is that the letter of excommunication did not originate with Leo, as he was already dead before it went out. But mail service, being what it was 1,000 years ago, meant that a lot of things went out while a lot of other things were going on, and no one knew what was going on most of the time. The result was that the patriarch found out that it was Cardinal Humbert who issued the bull in the name of the dead pope, and Michael found out. So he issued a bull of excommunication on the cardinal. Truthfully, for the patriarch, this was just the last straw. So he closed down all the Latin Western churches in Constantinople, stopped remembrance for the Pope in the prayers, wrote letters to the other patriarchs against the Pope. The Patriarch of Antioch, Peter III, rejected most of Michael's accusations against Rome and urged him to compromise. But nevertheless, the break began what is known as the Great East-West Schism. Now, entered into this Gregory VII, who instigated the reforms that restored the integrity of the election process I talked about earlier. But perhaps he is best known as the role he played in what's called the investiture controversy, which was a major outcome of the Gregorian reform because it pitted the papacy against secular rulers. Now, what is the investiture? Bishops and abbots were nominated and then installed by rulers in a ceremony known as an investiture. And then the consecration of the newly minted bishop by his superior would follow. So that's not the way it happens. The way is the church selects who's going to be the bishop or whatever, and then the church does the ordination. It's called an investiture crisis. But it very much created a huge conflict. And the problem really accelerated in England with King Henry IV. What is it with the Henrys and the popes? Henry IV said, they can say anything they want in Rome, we're going to do what we want in England, which is what England typically does anyway. But England quickly found out that when you go against the Pope, there are consequences. And so Henry IV was excommunicated, which meant all of the other rulers in Europe acknowledged his excommunication, which meant that no one's going to marry his daughters. And no daughters will be found for his sons. It was an absolute blow against the Plantagenet line. And so, in great humility, with his wife and child by his side, he stood outside the palace at Kasova for 4 days in the snow, begging entrance so that he could apologize. We need to see a little more of that out of our English monarchies.
Did you get in?
Oh, yes. And he was absolved, and things were good until Henry VIII. But the problem, of course, was centering on that dispute. But now we've established the primacy of papal authority and a new canon law governing the election of the Pope, finally by a college of cardinals. So this is where this finds its origin, is with the investiture controversy. He was the first pope to introduce an absolute policy of obligatory celibacy for the clergy, which until that time many had commonly married. And we can see in this pontificate a real pivot in the influence of the papacy, particularly gaining extraordinary power and setting the tone for the office of Peter for the future. And when we go from here, beginning around 1048, in a conflict between the popes and the Holy Empire, we begin to trace from the Council of Clermont the beginning of a movement called the Crusades. Now, I'm not going to spend any time on the Crusade. That deserves its own thing. But it is at the council in 1096 at the Council of Clermont that the first crusade was announced by Urban II in order to reclaim the Holy Land from the Saracens. And then we retrace 1257 to 1309 in a time we call the Wandering Popes. And that's followed by what's known as the very famous Avignon Papacy. And that goes from 1309 to 1377. And then from 1378 to 1417 is what's called the Western Schism. The medieval papacy, spanning roughly from the 6th to the 16th century, saw the Pope's role evolve from a purely spiritual leader to a significant political figure in Europe. Initially focused on religious authority, the papacy gradually acquired territorial power, began to influence European politics, and even engaged in conflicts with secular rulers like the Holy Roman Emperors. And in certain cases, the Roman pontiffs themselves would lead armies, much like the Roman emperors would do. You'll see this in Julius II. This era saw a lot of conflict between papacy and religious or secular rulers, and particularly with the Holy Roman emperors, and again, over the whole issue of the power of bishops. The idea of papal supremacy, where the Pope is seen as the ultimate authority in the church, even over secular rulers, is gaining considerable traction. The Pope of interest in these early years is Innocent III, who is going to exercise significant influence over the European monarchs. You could almost point Innocent III, a fascinating name, as being the one who literally governs the Western world, without question. It's during this time, the Crusades, in which we see an enormous incursion of the Saracen hordes, particularly in the Iberian Peninsula. And that's going to color the papacy and the Western Church for the next several hundred years. Italian politics, for one, and the pressure of the French monarch for another, is going to be a constant problem. After Pope Boniface VIII's conflict with King Philip IV, resulting in his arrest and death, the next Pope, Clement V, a Frenchman, was elected amid significant French influence over the cardinals. Philip IV pressured Clement V to move the papacy out of Rome and get away from the Theophylacty, to get away from the influence of these Roman families. So people say, oh, it's terrible. They moved the papacy to Avignon. No, it's a good thing that they moved the papacy to Avignon. There was too much instability in Rome. Rome was a dangerous, unstable city. It was characterized by political conflicts, struggles with these families, and so the Pope needed a more secure location for papal administration, and a strategic location was Avignon. And there he established the papal enclave and secured government. He allowed the papacy to consolidate its administrative and government functions away from all that Roman chaos. And it offered protection, particularly under the King of France. So no one could get to Avignon without getting past the king's armies. That was even better. Although this ultimately made the papacy somewhat beholden to the French crown. And that's going to dilute its independence. So what happens after that? Well, that move actually damaged the prestige of the papacy, as it was now seen as being under the influence of the French monarchs, which is exactly what the French monarchs wanted. A perception amplified by the large number of French cardinals that were appointed during this period. But it's also then subsequently called the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. And this wonderful Italian scholar, Francesco Petrarch, dubbed this period the Babylonian captivity, criticizing the popes for becoming too involved in worldly political affairs and losing their spiritual integrity. By the way, remember that name, Petrarch. He is going to join another European brain named Erasmus of Rotterdam. And together, they are going to give birth to a whole new movement within Western culture known as humanism. We're not going to talk that now. All right. Significant changes in the papacy's relationship with France and the Holy Roman Empire. There are shifts in papal authority. And who are these Avignon popes? Well, Clement V we mentioned. He's the one that moved it. Then you've got John the 22nd, Benedict the 12th, Clement VI, Innocent VI, Urban V, and then very important is Gregory XI, who returned the papacy to Rome in 1377, which ended the Avignon papacy, but it did not end the problems. The move to Avignon was initially motivated by a need to be protected from all the political instability in Rome, and with desire to have the protection of the considerable influences of the French king. But in 1376, with the going back to Rome, the long-term consequences of the Avignon papacy started to be felt. And that included a huge decline in papal authority, ultimately leading to what we would call the Great Western Schism, where multiple claimants to the papacy existed. After Gregory's death in 1378, relationships deteriorated between his successor Urban VI and a faction of cardinals, and all of this resulted in the schism, which started a second line of Avignon popes, regarded as illegitimate. The last Avignon antipope, Benedict XIII, lost most of his support in 1398, including that of France. And after 5 years of being besieged by the French, he fled to Perpignan in 1403. And then the schism ended with the decrees of the Council of Florence in 1417. But this whole period where we have rival claimants to the title of Pope is referred to as this Western Schism, and at one time you had 3 popes. You had a Pope in Milan, you had a Pope in France, and you had a Pope in Rome. Who's Pope? Parties within the church were divided in their allegiance among these claimants. So Clement VII in France, Alexander V, and actually it was in Pisa, and Urban VI in Rome, they finally resolved the controversy when a woman stepped in. Enter Catherine of Siena, who said these men don't have a clue as to what they're doing, and oftentimes it takes a woman to straighten things out. And she did. She marched into each one of them and said, "No, look." She had a certain authority about her, as nuns often do, striking fear in the hearts of even the most substantial of men. And so through quite a number of machinations, Catherine of Siena managed to bring the papacy back to Rome as one thing. And that ends with the election of Pope Martin V, which was accepted by all of the others as a legitimate pope. We have not covered much space, but I want to leave a little bit of time for conversation and questions as we move on tonight.
Was she a nun? Was she a nun?
Catherine of Siena?
Yes. She was involved with the church? No.
She was a consecrated virgin. You had different. This is still an era in which you don't have a lot of orders. The only orders that really exist at this point in time are the mendicants. You have a certain number of orders. The oldest of orders are the clausures, the cloistered orders, and they are the earliest, and that's the Benedictines. And of course, the Benedictines have many declensions and many reforms. So out of the Benedictines, you would have the Carthusians. You would have another form of Benedictines in the monastery of Clairvaux. It's founded by St. Bernard of Clairvaux. And then they're referred to, of course, as the Trappists. And there's multiple others. And this is all beginning around the year 800. So by the 11th century, a new form of religious life is becoming popular, And it is not involved in building a house, creating a community of people, but rather going out into the world for evangelization. And this has begun with the Franciscans. And the Franciscans give birth to many others. First of all, many other different kinds of Franciscans, but most notably the Dominicans. Now, eventually, all of these orders are going to have a male component and a female component. All the way down the line. But all along that, you also have what we call cenobitic lifestyle. People who wanted to live apart from the world as hermits. And so they wanted to experience a holiness that somehow or another they weren't finding in the local parish church. And they would lead these ascetic lives and draw attention to themselves and draw communities unto themselves of people who would emulate Catholicism among those. Okay. Andrew.
Could you explain where and how the Hospitaliers, the Knights of St. John, figured into this? Because they were kind of independent in so many ways.
Okay, so the question, they have really absolutely nothing to do with any of this. You're talking about, these are...
the only people who were allowed in Palestine during the period from 1000 to about 1400.
You're talking about the military orders.
Yep.
And there were a number of those, and they all originate from the early 11th century, early and mid-11th century. And their main role is to be soldiers for Christ. The initial rule that they had was to reclaim the Holy Land for the church. And so out of that group, you had a variety of different purposes and focuses. But the oldest of the orders was the order of the Holy Sepulchre. Of Jerusalem. This order dates from 1055. Its purpose was to reclaim the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb of Christ. It was a military order. They were knights. They were literally knights in armor on horseback. Not all of these military orders did as much good as we might think they did. And like many of the Crusades, got caught up maybe in between where they originated in the Holy Land were cities with a lot of money, and so they just simply sacked them and killed all the residents and just took it over. But you also have the Knights of St. John that follow, and then the Knights Hospitallers. Knights Hospitallers. There are many, many more. And the orders go on and on the Knights of Malta.
That's more the word St. John.
Yeah, and
But they had three suborders, right, in this thing?
as they developed along. But they became less military and more honorific. And like the Knights of Malta, as they're known today, it's usually reserved to the royalty or nobility. Anybody can be Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem. There's 3 or 4 of them in the room right now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How many of you are Knights of the Holy Sepulchre? Yeah, there's Knights of the Holy Sepulchre. We're ubiquitous. But it's the oldest and largest of the military orders. Karen.
At what point do we have ordained priests, and only priests with the authority to celebrate sacraments?
What? I'm not sure I understand your question.
When do we have an ordained priesthood? At what point do we actually have an ordination ceremony for priests?
Well, we don't have an absolute pinpoint of when the ceremony as we know it today, it evolved. But it dates back to 64, 80, roughly. Sir?
What was the real motivation for the papacy becoming superior to the secular government and authority? What was papacy attempting to do? And the motivation for doing that?
Well, remember, I don't know if you caught this or not, but most of in the Middle Ages, most of those occupants of the chair of Peter were members of noble families who had vested interest in land and money, prestige and control. All right? Ergo, they kind of set the tone, if you will, for the next few hundred years for the nature of the papacy. But again, you've got it's all set up by Constantine. Constantine's favoritism of the church. Constantine gave huge amount of authority to the bishops of the church and to the control of the church in their local areas. Because there was not that understanding of a difference between the religious life and the secular life. It was life. We compartmentalize it. We don't. And again, that's a pro-chronism to import that back into that era. That there would have been, there was no difference between the papacy and the king. It was, there were just the two bookends of that reality. Yes.
When did cardinals emerge?
Cardinal is not an order, and cardinal is not an ecclesiastical office. A cardinal is a recognition of someone's, well, ostensibly, of someone's accomplishments, if you will, or giving them the authority to do certain things. So there were cardinal deacons. The most important deacon within a community would have been the cardinal deacon. You had cardinal priests. Those titles still exist today. A lot of people are known as cardinal deacons, cardinal priests, cardinal bishops. But they are not an order in and of themselves. That's offered by the Pope to those individuals to occupy a particular office of authority, if you will. The Anglican Church uses that term for rectors of big cities. In a big Episcopal church in the city, the rector is called the cardinal rector of the city. Yep.
What was the motivation several hundred years before Gregory the Seventh and said priests need to become celibate?
The question is, why celibacy? Why was it celibacy? I think we were also beginning to see the emergence of the life of Christ, and that the clergy need to start imitating that life in its fullness. And Jesus didn't have a spouse, so if you're going to be acting in persona Christi, then you also not need to have the burden of that. And so that's the theological. The real reason is women are expensive.
And they're burdensome.
Are you forgetting?
If I had a wife, you couldn't pay, my salary right now is $33,000 a year. Ask me what woman would live on half of that. It's cheaper. And believe me, money talks. You can add your rest of the sentence then.
You don't believe that the diseases that were brought in by Marco Polo played a significant role in that belief in celibacy?
Marco Polo? One would think there'd be more influence from the Eastern clergy, because the Western church saw what trouble the Eastern clergy had with their wives and the demands that they made. And I think that this decision was probably more based on that than anything else. But volumes have not been written on that subject, as far as I know. Yes, sir.
So I've heard you mention the Catholics. I've heard you mention the Orthodox and even the Eastern Orthodox. Where did the Roman Catholics come around? Or is that just something that was thrust upon us?
Roman Catholicism is not we call ourselves Roman Catholics because everybody else does. We're simply Catholics.
I thought it was more about a Protestant thing that was thrust upon us because it just discouraged.
Yeah, exactly. But now the church has pretty much adopted that as being the Roman Catholic Church, as opposed to the Orthodox Church. And so it's really impossible to say the Orthodox Church, because there is no one Orthodox Church. There's the Orthodox Church in Russia. There's the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. There's the Orthodox Church in Greece. The hobby of all Orthodox bishops is to excommunicate another Orthodox bishop.
And is there not a supreme patriarch of the Eastern?
No.
Each of them are independent.
No, there is no one head of the Eastern Orthodox Church. The Eastern Orthodox Church is an overarching term. There's no such thing as the Eastern Orthodox Church. It's just a term that we use to gather together the more than 56 different varieties. And then to make things even more confusing is that when the East-West split occurred, you've got all the in-betweens. The people who lived, the Sorbs and the Slovenians, and everybody that lived in what we would call the Near Eastern Europe, whose liturgies were exactly like the Orthodox liturgy, but now they were part of the Western Church. But their liturgy is not Western in any way, shape, or form, nor is it a language, as most of them would adopt one form or another of the Cyrillic alphabet and the language that went with it. And so that's why we have 38 separate rites within the Western Catholic Church. Most of those being some form or other of orthodoxy. It's the Bulgarian Orthodox, the Ruthenian Orthodox, the Coptic Church, the Maronite Rite, which is here in Austin, the Syro-Malabarese Rite, which is the Catholic Church in northern India, the Malankara Rite, also in India and Pakistan. I mean, I can just keep going down the line, and they're all very, very different, one from another. And each one has its own eparchy. Each one, like in the United States, especially going back east, you will find that you'll have these dioceses of those particular rites that coexist with the Latin Rite dioceses. And if you go to the big ceremonies, particularly back east, and you see the procession of bishops, some of them are wearing those big round crowns.
Yeah.
And that's the garb of the Latin Rite, Eastern rites of the Catholic Church. Very complicated, very confusing.
So could a pope come from any one of those rites?
Can a pope come from any one? Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah.
We can attend that Maronite church.
Absolutely, yeah. Father Don Sawyer, many of you probably know Father Don, is the founder of Arlington Maronite Church. Was at one time the associate pastor of the cathedral. And before that, he was the associate pastor of St. Anthony's in Bryan. So he was ordained, he's actually from Austin. He was ordained what we call bi-ritual. He can celebrate the Latin Rite as well as the Maronite Rite, but he chooses only to do the Maronite Rite, which is simply the church in Lebanon. It's not there. It is the Catholic Church in Lebanon, is what it is.
Thank you.
All right, next week it'll be a marathon. Because we're gonna slide right through the Medicis, the Sforzas, the Della Roveris, the Borgias, and all of the horrors that leads us to Charles II, Henry VIII, John Calvin, Martin Luther, Ulrich Zwingli, and then we'll do that as fast as humanly possible, and then jump into the Counter-Reformation and how the church regrouped, reestablished itself, and became a whole new entity for the Western world and launched the greatest missionary activity in the history of the church, with the founding of an order that comes out of the Counter-Reformation, the Jesuits. All right, let's have our prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for our time together as we look at our very colorful history and the many ways in which the gates of hell have not prevailed against it. We ask that you would send us now on our way in peace, that we may be faithful followers of your way. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Son, and Holy Spirit. Thank you all so much.